The persistence of green. It's funny how the loudest thing in a house can be the silence. For Mara, the mornings used to be a messy symphony of clinking spoons and radio news. Now it was just the hum of the refrigerator. She stood in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to whistle, watching the dust motes dance in a single beam of light. She was doing fine, she told herself. She went to work, she paid the bills, she ate her toast, but the air always felt a little thin, like she was breathing through a veil. The hardest part wasn't the big things. It was the inventory of twos that had become ones. The 2 pillows on the bed, one perpetually cool. The 2 chairs at the small dining table, one pushed neatly into place, never to be disturbed. Mara found herself avoiding that chair. It had become a monument to Elias, a silent reminder of the space he used to occupy with his loud laugh and his habit of tapping his fingers on the wood while he read the paper. One Saturday, Mara finally stepped out onto the balcony. It had been months. The small space was a graveyard of their shared dreams. There were terracotta pots filled with nothing but gray, cracked earth, and the brittle skeletal remains of what used to be a thriving herb garden. Elias had been the one with the green thumb. He used to say that plants just needed a little conversation and a lot of patience. Since he'd been gone, Mara hadn't had the heart for either. She closed her eyes and could almost feel his hands over hers, rough and warm. Elias had been teaching her how to transplant the basil seedlings just a week before the accident. "Don't be afraid to get your fingernails dirty, Mara," he'd whispered, his breath smelling of peppermint tea. The roots need to know their home. He had a way of making the simplest task feel like a sacred ritual. Elias was the kind of man who found joy in the mundane. Mara remembered him standing in the middle of this very balcony, holding a single, perfectly ripe cherry tomato like it was a ruby. He had been so proud of that tiny harvest. He lived with such a vibrant, unhurried presence that his sudden absence felt like a physical weight, a gravity that made her feet feel heavy every time she tried to move forward. The grief didn't come in waves anymore. It was more like a low tide that never went back out. Mara sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by his old books, feeling a sudden sharp ache in her chest. It was the realization that she was starting to forget the exact pitch of his voice. She tried to say his name out loud, but the room just swallowed the sound. She felt incredibly, hopelessly alone in a world that kept spinning while she was stuck in place. A few days later, while cleaning the balcony to finally throw the pots away, she saw it. In the corner of the largest pot, hidden under a layer of dead leaves and dust, was a tiny, stubborn speck of green. It was a sprout, no bigger than a fingernail, pushing through the parched, neglected earth. It shouldn't have been there. It hadn't been watered in months. It had survived the frost and the abandonment. Mara reached for the old watering can. Her hands shook a little as she filled it at the kitchen sink. She walked back out and carefully, almost breathlessly, let a slow trickle of water soak into the soil around the sprout. "Okay," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "Okay, let's try." It was the first time in a long time she had spoken to something living. The water turned the gray earth into a deep, rich brown. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. Mara started visiting the garden center. She bought a bag of fresh soil, some organic fertilizer, and a few new packets of seeds. Her fingernails were constantly stained with dirt, just like Elias had encouraged. She found herself talking to the plants, telling them about her day, about the weather, and sometimes about him. The silent apartment began to fill with the quiet life of growing things. Summer arrived, and the balcony was a riot of green and gold. Mara sat in her chair, the only chair out there, eating a sandwich topped with fresh basil from her own pots. The grief hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer a weight. It was the soil that her new life was growing in. She looked at the empty chair in the kitchen through the glass door and didn't feel a hole anymore. She felt a connection. She wasn't alone. She was part of the rhythm again.